Section 29 of Our Southern Highlanders by Horace Kephart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Southern Highlanders, Chapter 15, The Blood Feud, Part 1. In Corsica, when a man is wronged by another, public sentiment requires that he redress his own grievance, and that his family and friends shall share the consequences. Before the law made us citizens, great nature made us men. When one has an enemy, one must choose between three S's: Sciappetto, stiletto, strada, the rifle, the dagger, or flight. There are two presents to be made to an enemy: palla calda o ferro freddo, hot shot or cold steel. The Corsican code of honor does not require that vengeance be taken in a fair fight. Rather, should there be a sudden thrust of the knife, or a pistol fired point blank into the enemy's breast, or a rifle shot from some ambush picked in advance, the assassin is not conscious of any cowardice in such act. If the trouble between him and his foe had been strictly a personal matter, to be settled forever by one man's fall, then he might have welcomed a duel with all of the punctilios. But his blood is not his alone. It belongs to his clan. Whenever a Corsican is slain, his family takes up the feud. A vendetta ensues, a war of extermination by clan against clan. Now, the chief object of war, as all strategists agree, is to inflict the greatest loss upon the enemy with the least loss to one's own side. Hence, we have hostilities without declaration of war. We have the ambush, the night attack, masked batteries, mines, and submarines. Thus, we murder hundreds, asleep or unshriven. This is war. Moreover, while a soldier must be brave in any extremity, it is no less his duty to save himself unharmed as long as he can, so that he may help his own side and kill more and more of the enemy. Therefore, it is proper and military for him to snipe his foes by deliberate sharp shooting from behind any lurking place that he can find. This is war. And the vendetta, says our Corsican, is nothing else than war. When Matteo has been slain by an enemy, his friends carry his body home and swear vengeance over the corpse, while his wife soaks her handkerchief in his wounds to keep as a token, whereby she will incite her children as they grow up to war against all kinsmen of their father's murderer. And then a son or brother of Matteo slips forth into the night, full armed to slay, like a dog, any member of the rival faction whom he may find at a disadvantage. The deed done, he flies to the maquis, the mountain thicket, and there he will hide, dodging the gendarme, fighting off his enemies, an outlaw with a price upon his head, but pitied or admired by all Corsicans outside the feud, and succored by his clan. It is a far cry from the Mediterranean to our own Appalachia, so why this prelude? Our mountaineers never heard of Corsica. Not a drop of South European blood flows in their veins. Few of them ever heard one word of a foreign tongue. True. And yet we shall mark some strange analogies between Corsican vendettas and the Appalachian feuds, Corsican clannishness and Appalachian clannishness, Corsican women and our mountain women, before this chapter ends. Long, long ago, in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, Dr. Abner Baker married a Miss White. Daniel Bates married Baker's sister, but separated from her in 1844. Baker charged Bates with undue intimacy with his wife and killed him. The Whites, defending their kinswoman, prosecuted the doctor, but he was acquitted and moved to Cuba. Afterwards, Baker returned In flat violation of the Constitution of the United States, he was tried a second time for the murder of Bates, was convicted, and was hanged. Thenceforth there was bad blood between the Bakers and the Whites, involving the Gerards on one side and the Howards on the other, as allies to the respective clans. In 1898, Tom Baker, reputed to be the best shot in the Kentucky mountains, bought a note given by A.B. Howard, for whom he was cutting timber. Howard became furious. A fight ensued. One of the Howard boys and Bert Storrs were killed from ambush, and the elder Howard was wounded. Thereupon, Jim Howard, son of the clan chief, sought out Tom Baker's father, who was county attorney, compelled the unarmed old man to fall upon his knees, shot him 25 times with careful aim to avoid a vital spot, and so killed him by inches. Howard was tried and convicted of murder, but it is said that a pardon was offered him if he would go to the state capital at Frankfort and assassinate Governor Goebel, which he is charged with having done. In Clay County, where this feud waged, the judge, clerk, sheriff, and jailer were of the White clan. Tom Baker killed a brother of the sheriff and took to the hills rather than give himself up to a court ruled by his foemen. Then Albert Gerard was fired upon from ambush while riding with his wife to a religious meeting. He removed to Pineville in another county, under guard of 2 armed men, both of whom were shot dead from the breach. Governor Bradley sent state troops into Clay County, and Tom Baker surrendered to them. Baker was tried in the Knox Circuit Court on a change of venue and was sentenced to the penitentiary for life. On appeal, his attorneys secured a reversal of the verdict, and Baker was released on bail. The new trial was set for June 1899. Governor Bradley, again, sent a company of state militia with a Gatling gun to Manchester, where the trial was to be held. Baker was put in a guard tent surrounded by a squad of soldiers. 100 yards or so from this tent stood the unoccupied residence of the sheriff at the foot of a wooded mountain. An assassin, hidden in this house, spied upon the guard tent, and when Baker appeared, shot him dead with a rifle, and then took to the woods and escaped. I quote now from a history of this feud published in Munsey's Magazine of November 1903. Captain John Bryan of the 2nd Kentucky said to the widow of the murdered Tom Baker after they returned from the funeral, "Mrs. Baker, why don't you leave this miserable country and escape from these terrible feuds? Move away and teach your children to forget." "Captain Bryan," said the widow, as she spoke evenly and quietly, "I have 12 sons. It will be the chief aim of my life to bring them to avenge their father's death. Each day I shall show my boys the handkerchief stained with his blood and tell them who murdered him." Corsican vendetta or Kentucky feud, what are language and race against age-long isolation and an environment that keeps humanity feral to the core? Shortly after Baker's death, 4 Griffins of the White Howard faction ambushed Big John Philpotts and his cousin, wounding the former severely and the latter mortally. Big John fought them from behind a log and killed all 4. On July 17, 1899, 4 of the Philpotts were attacked by 4 Morrises of the Howard side. 3 men were killed, 3 mortally wounded, and the other 2 were severely injured. No arrests were made. Finally, in 1901, the 2 clans fought a pitched battle in front of the courthouse in Manchester. At its conclusion, they formally signed a truce. This is a mere scenario of a feud in the wealthiest and best-schooled county of eastern Kentucky. 2 of the families involved were of distinguished lineage, counting in their ranks a governor, 3 generals, a member of Congress, and a Prohibition candidate for the presidency. In reviewing this feud, Governor Bradley stated, "The whole fault of Clay County is a vitiated public sentiment and a failure of the civil authorities to do their duty. The laws are insufficient for the governor to apply a remedy. Such feuds have been in progress more or less for years, and no governor of the state has ever been able to quell them. They have terminated only when their force was spent by one side or the other being killed or moving out of the country. The laws are insufficient for the governor to apply a remedy. One naturally asks, how so? The answer is that the governor cannot send troops into a county except upon request of the civil authorities, and they must go as a posse to civil officers. In most feuds, these officers are partisans. In fact, it is a favorite ruse for one clan to win or usurp the county offices before making war. Hence, the state troops would only serve as a reinforcement to one of the contending factions. To show how this works out, we will sketch briefly the course of another feud. In Rowan County, Kentucky, in 1884, there was an election quarrel between two members of the Martin and the Tolliver families. The Logans sided with the Martins, and the Youngs with the Tollivers. The Logan-Martin faction elected their candidate for sheriff by a margin of 12 votes. Then there was an affray in which one Logan was killed and 3 were wounded. As usual in feuds, no immediate redress was attempted, but the injured clan plotted its vengeance with deadly deliberation. After 5 months, Dick Martin killed Floyd Tolliver. His own people worked the trick of arresting him themselves and sent him to Winchester for safekeeping. The Tollivers succeeded in having him brought back on a forged order and killed him when he was bound and helpless. The leader of the young Tolliver faction was a notorious bravo named Craig Tolliver. To strengthen his power, he became a candidate for town marshal of Morehead, and he won the office by intimidation at the polls. Then, for 2 years, a bushwhacking war went on. 3 times the governor sent troops into Rowan County, but each time they found nothing but creeks and thickets to fight. And then he prevailed upon the clans to sign a truce and expatriate their chiefs for 1 year in distant states. Craig Tolliver obeyed the order by going to Missouri, but returned several months before the expiration of his term, resumed office, and renewed his atrocities. In the warfare that ensued, all the county officers were involved from the judge down. In 1887, Proctor Knott, governor of Kentucky, said in his message of the Logan-Tolliver feud, "Though composed of only a small portion of the community, these factions have succeeded by their violence in overawing and silencing the voice of the peaceful element and in intimidating the officers of the law. Having their origin partly in party rancor, they have ceased to have any political significance and have become contests of personal ambition and revenge, each party seeking apparently to possess itself of the machinery of justice in order that it may, under the forms of law, seek the gratification of personal animosities." During the present year, the local leader of one of these factions came in possession of the office of police judge of the town of Morehead. Under color of the authority of that office and sustained by an armed band of adherents, he exercised despotic sway over the town and its vicinage. He banished citizens who were obnoxious to him, and in one instance, after arresting 2 citizens who seemed to have been guilty of no offense, he and his party, attended by a deputy sheriff of the county, murdered them in cold blood. This act of atrocity fully aroused the community. A posse, acting under the authority of a warrant from the county judge, attacked the police judge and his adherents on the 23rd of June last, killed several of their number, and put the rest to flight, and temporarily restored something like tranquility to the community. The proceedings of the circuit court, which was held in August, were not calculated to inspire the citizens with confidence in securing justice. The report of the Adjutant General on this subject shows, from information derived from representative men without reference to party affiliations, that the judge of the circuit court seems so far under the influence of the reputed leader of one of the factions as to permit such an organization of the grand juries as will effectually prevent the indictment of members of that faction for the most flagrant crimes. The posse here mentioned was organized by Daniel Boone Logan, a cousin of the two young men who had been murdered, a college graduate and a lawyer of good standing. With the assent of the governor, he gathered 50 to 75 picked men and armed them with the best modern rifles and revolvers. Some of the men were of his own clan, others he hired. His plan was to end the war by exterminating the Tollivers. The posse, led by Logan and the sheriff, suddenly surrounded the town of Moorhead. Everybody gave in except Craig Tolliver, Jay Tolliver, Bud Tolliver, and Hiram Cook, who barricaded themselves in the railroad station, where all of them were shot dead by the posse. Boone Logan was indicted for murder. At the trial, he admitted the killings, but he showed that the feud had cost the lives of not less than 23 men, that not one person had been legally punished for these murders, and that he had acted for the good of the public in ending the infamous struggle. The court accepted this view of the case, the community sustained it, and the war was closed. A feud, in the restricted sense here used, is an armed conflict between families, each endeavoring to exterminate or drive out the other. It spreads swiftly, not only to blood kin and relatives by marriage, but to friends and retainers as well. It may lie dormant for a time, perhaps for a generation, and then burst forth with recruited strength long after its original cause has ceased to interest anyone, or maybe after it has been forgotten. Such feuds are by no means prevalent throughout the length and breadth of Appalachia, but are restricted mostly to certain well-defined districts, of which the chief, in extent of territory, as well as in the manner and number and ferocity of its wars, is the country round the upper waters of the Kentucky, Licking, Big Sandy, Tug, and Cumberland rivers, embracing many of the mountain counties of eastern Kentucky and adjoining parts of West Virginia, Old Virginia, and Tennessee. In this thinly settled region, probably 500 men have been slain in feuds since our centennial year, and only 3 of the murderers, so far as I know, have been executed by law. The active feudists, as a rule, include only a small part of the community, but public sentiment in feud districts approves or at least tolerates the vendetta, just as it does in Corsica or the Balkans. Those citizens who are not directly implicated take pains to hear little and see less. They keep their mouths shut. They can neither be persuaded, bribed, nor coerced into informing or testifying against either side, but on the contrary, will throw dust in the eyes of an investigator or try to stare him down. A jury composed of such men will not convict anybody. When a feud is raging, nobody outside the warring clans is in any danger at all. A stranger is safer in the heart of feudom than he would be in Chicago or New York, so long as he attends strictly to his own business, asks no questions, and tells no tales. If, on the contrary, he should express horror or curiosity, he is regarded as a busybody or suspected as a spy, and is likely to be run out of the country or even laywayed and silenced forever. End of section 29. Section 30 of Our Southern Highlanders by Horace Kephart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Southern Highlanders, Chapter 15, The Blood Feud, Part 2. What causes feuds? Some of them start in mere drunken rows or in a dispute over a game of cards. Others in quarrels over land boundaries or other property. The Hatfield-McCoy feud started because Randolph McCoy pinned up 2 wild hogs that were claimed by Floyd Hatfield. The spite over these hogs broke out 2 years later, and one partisan was killed from ambush. The feud itself began in 1882 over a debt of $1.75, with the hogs and the bushwhacking brought up in recrimination. Love of women is the primary cause or the secondary aggravation of many a feud. Some of the most widespread and deadliest vendettas have originated in political strifes. It should be understood that national and state politics cut little or no figure in these wars. Local politics in most of the mountain counties is merely a factional fight in which family matters and business interests are involved, and the contest becomes bitterly personal on that account. This explains most of the collusion or partisanship of county officers and their remissness in enforcing the law in murder cases. Family ties or political alliances override even the oath of office. Within the past year, I have heard a deputy sheriff admit nonchalantly on the stand that when a homicide was committed near him and he was the only officer in the vicinity, he advised the slayer to take to the mountains and hide out. The judge questioned him sharply on this point, was reassured by the witness that it was so, and then offered no comment at all. Within the same period, in another but not distant court, a desperado from the Shelton Laurel on trial for murder admitted that he had shot 6 men since he moved over from Tennessee to North Carolina, and swore that while he was being held in jail pending trial for this last offense, the sheriff permitted him to keep a gun in his cell, drink whiskey in the jail, and eat at a table with the family of the sheriff. Feuds spread not only through clan fealty, but also because they offer excellent chances to pay off old scores. The mountaineer has a long memory. The average Highlander is fiery and combative by nature, but at the same time cunning and vindictive. If publicly insulted, he will strike at once, but if he feels wronged by some act that does not demand instant retaliation, he will brood over it and plot patiently to get his enemy at a disadvantage. Some mountaineers always fight fair, but many of them prefer to wait and watch quietly until the foe gets drunk and unwary, or until he is engaged in some illegal or scandalous act, or until he is known to be carrying a concealed weapon, whereupon he can be shot down unexpectedly, and his assailant can prove by friendly witnesses that he acted in self-defense. So, if a man be involved in a feud, he may be assassinated from ambush by someone who is not concerned in the clan trouble, but who has hated him for years on another account, and who knows that his death now will be charged up to the opposing faction. From the earliest times, it has been customary for our Highlanders to go armed most of the time. This was a necessity in the old Indian fighting days and throughout the Ku Kluxing and white-capping era following the Civil War. Such a habit, once formed, is hard to eradicate. Even today, in all parts of Appalachia that I am familiar with, most of the young men I judge and many of the older ones carry concealed weapons. Among them, I have never seen a stand-up and knock-down fight, according to the rules of the ring. They have many rough-and-tumble brawls in which they slug, wrestle, kick, bite, strangle, until one gets the other down, whereat the one on top continues to maul his victim until he cries, "Enough!" Oftener, a club or a stone will be used in mad endeavor to knock the opponent senseless at a blow. There is no compunction about striking foul and very little about double teaming. Let us pause long enough to admit that this was the British and American way of manhandling, universal among the common people until well into the 19th century, and the mountaineers are still ignorant of any other except fighting with weapons. Many of the young men carry homemade billies or brass knucks. Every man and boy has at least a pocket knife with a serviceable blade. Fights with such crude weapons are frequent. There are few spectacles more sickening than two powerful but awkward men slashing each other with common jackknives, though the fatalities are much less frequent than in gunfighting. I have known 2 old mountain preachers to draw knives on each other at the close of a sermon. The typical Highland bravo always carries a revolver or an automatic pistol. This is likely to be a weapon of large bore and good stopping power that is worn in a shoulder holster, concealed under the coat or vest or shirt. Most mountaineers are good shots with such arms, though not so deadly quick as the frontiersmen of our old-time West. In fact, they cannot be so quick without wearing the weapon exposed. When a Highlander has time, he prefers to hold his pistol in both hands, left clasped over right, and aims it as he would a rifle. To a Westerner, such gun practice looks absurd, but it is accurate beyond question. Few mountain gunfights fail to score at least one victim. The average mountain woman is as combative in spirit as her menfolk. She would despise any man who took insult or injury without showing fight. In fact, the woman, in many cases, deliberately stirs up trouble out of vanity or for the sheer excitement of it. Some of the older women display the ferocity of she-wolves. The mother of a large family said in my presence with the calm earnestness of one fully experienced, "If a feller treated me the way so-and-so did so-and-so, I'd get me a 40-some-odd and shoot enough meat off of his bones to feed a hound dog a week." 3 of this woman's brothers had been shot dead in frays. One of them killed the first husband of her sister, who married again, and whose second husband was killed by a man with whom she then tried a third matrimonial venture. Such matters may not be interesting in themselves, but they give one pause when he learns, in addition, that these people are received as friends and on a footing of equality by everybody in their community. That the mountaineers are fierce and relentless in their feuds is beyond denial. A warfare of bushwhacking and assassination knows no refinements. Quarter is neither given nor expected. Property, however, is not violated, and women are not often injured. There have been some atrocious exceptions. In the Hatfield-McCoy feud, Cap Hatfield and Tom Wallace attacked the latter's wife and her mother at night, dragged both women from the bed, and Cap beat the old woman with a cow's tail that he'd clipped off just to see her jump. He broke 2 of the woman's ribs, leaving her injured for life, while Tom beat his wife. Later, on New Year's night in 1888, a gang of the Hatfields surrounded the home of Randolph McCoy, killed the eldest daughter, Alifair, broke her mother's ribs and knocked her senseless with their guns, and killed a son, Calvin. In several instances, women who fought in defense of their homes have been killed, as in the case of Mrs. Charles Daniels and her 16-year-old daughter in Pike County, Kentucky, in November 1909. The mountain women do not shrink from feuds, but on the contrary excite and cheer their men to desperate deeds, and sometimes fight by their side. In the French Eversole feud, a woman, learning that her unarmed husband was besieged by his foes, seized his rifle, filled her apron with cartridges, rushed past the firing line, and stood by her old man until he beat his assailants off. When men are hiding out in the laurel, it is the woman's part, which they never shirk, to carry them food and information. In every feud, each clan has a leader, a man of prominence either on account of his wealth or his political influence or his shrewdness or his physical prowess. This leader's orders are obeyed, while hostilities last, with the same unquestioning loyalty that the old Scotch retainer showed to his chieftain. Either the leader or someone acting for him supplies the men with food, with weapons if they need them, with ammunition, and with money. Sometimes mercenaries are hired. Mr. Fox says that in one local war, I remember $4 per day were the wages of a fighting man, and the leader on one occasion, while besieging his enemies in the county courthouse, tried to purchase a cannon, and from no other place than the state arsenal, and from no other personage than the governor himself. In some of the feuds, professional bravos have been employed who would assassinate for a few dollars anybody who was pointed out to them, provided he was alien to their own clan. The character of the Highland bravo is precisely that of the Western bad man as pictured by Jed Parker in Stuart Edwards White's Arizona Nights. There's a good deal of romance been written about the bad man, and there's about the same amount of nonsense. The bad man is just a plain murderer, neither more nor less. He never does get into a real good plain stand-up gunfight if he can possibly help it. His killing are done from behind a door or when he's got his man dead to rights. There's Sam Cooke. You've all heard of him. He had nerve, of course, and when he was backed into a corner he made good, and he was sure sudden death with a gun. But when he went out for a man deliberate, he didn't take no special chances. The point is that these here bad men are a low-down, miserable proposition and plain, cold-blooded murderers, willing to wait for a sure thing and without no compunction whatever. The bad man takes you unawares when you're sleeping or talking or drinking or looking to see what for a day is going to be. Anyway, he don't give you no show, and sooner or later he's going to get you in the safest and the easiest way for himself. There ain't no romance about that. And there's no romance about the real mountain feud. It is marked by suave treachery, double teaming, laywaying, blind shooting, and general heartlessness and brutality. If one side refuses to assassinate but seeks open, honorable combat, as has happened in several feuds, it is sure to be beaten. Whoever appeals to the law is sure to be beaten. In either case, he is considered a fool or a coward by most of the countryside. Our Highlander, untouched by the culture of the world about him, has never been taught the meaning of fair play. Magnanimity to the fallen foe he would regard as sure proof of an addled brain. The motive of one who forgives his enemy is utterly beyond his comprehension. As for bushwhacking, it's as far for one as 'tis for the other. You can't fight a man fair and square who'll shoot you in the back. A poor man can't fight money in the courts. In this he is simply his ancient Scotch or English ancestor born over again. Such was the code of Jacobite Scotland and Tudor England. And back there is where our mountaineers belong in the scale of human evolution. The feud, as Miss Miles puts it, is an outbreak of perverted family affection. Its mainspring is an honorable clan loyalty. It is a direct consequence of the clan organization that our mountaineers preserve as it was handed down to them by their forefathers. The implacability of their vengeance, the treacheries that they practice, the murders from ambush are invariable features of clan warfare wherever and by whomsoever it is waged. They are not vices or crimes peculiar to the Kentuckian or the Corsican or the Sicilian or the Albanian or the Arab, but natural results of clan government, which, in turn, is a result of isolation, of physical environment, of geographical position unfavorable to free intercourse and commerce with the world at large. The most hideous feature of a feud is the shooting down of unarmed or unwarned men. Assassination, in our modern eyes, is the last and lowest infamy of a coward. Such it truly is when committed in the civilized society of our day, but in studying primitive races or in going back along the line of our own ancestry to the civilized society of 2 centuries ago, we must face and acknowledge the strange paradox of a valorous and honorable people, according to their lights, who in certain cases practiced assassination without compunction, and in fact with pride. History is read with it in those very richest ages of our race that Professor Shaler cited. Until a century or 2 ago, throughout Christendom, the secret murder of enemies was committed unblushingly by nobles and kings and prelates, often with a pious "Thus saith the Lord." It was practiced by men valiant in open battle and by those wise in the councils of the realm. Take Scotland, for example, as pictured by a native writer. No tenet, nor practice, no influence, nor power, no principality in the Scotland of the past has outvied assassination in ascendancy or in moment. Not theoretically, indeed, but practically. It occupied for centuries a distinct, almost a supreme place in her political constitution, was, in fact, the understood, if not recognized, expedient always in reserve should other milder and more hallowed methods fail of accomplishing the desired political, or it might be, religious consummation. For centuries, such justice was as exercised, was haphazard and rude, and practically there was no law but the will of the stronger. Few, if any, of the great families but had their special feud, and feuds once originated survived for ages. To forget them would have been treason to the dead, and wild purposes of revenge were handed down from generation to generation as a sacred legacy. To take an enemy at a disadvantage was not deemed mean and contemptible, but of all the arts in which the wise excel, nature's chief masterpiece. To do it boldly and adroitly was to win a peculiar halo of renown, and thus assassination ceased to be the weapon of the avowed desperado, and came to be wielded unblushingly not only by so-called men of honor, but by the so-called religious as well. A noble did not scruple to use it against his king, and the king himself felt no dishonor in resorting to it against a dangerous noble. James I was hacked to death in the night by Sir Robert Graham, and James I rid himself of the imperious and intriguing Douglas by suddenly stabbing him while within his own royal palace under the protection of a safe conduct. The leaders of the Reformation discerned in assassination that of their enemies. The special work and judgment of God. When the assassination of Cardinal Beaton took place in 1546, all the savage details of it were set down by Knox with unbridled gusto. These things we read merely in his own ingenious comment on his performance. The burden of George Buchanan's De jure regne apud Scotos is the lawfulness or righteousness of the removal by assassination or any other fitting or convenient means of incompetent kings, whether heinously wicked and tyrannical or merely unwise and weak of purpose. And he cites, as a case in point, and an example in time coming, the murder of James III, which, if it were only on account of the assassin's hideous travesty of the last offices of the Church, would deserve to be held in unique and everlasting detestation. Henderson, Old World Scotland, pages 182 through 186. Yet, the Scots have always been a notably warlike and fearless race. So too are our Southern Mountaineers. In the Civil War and the Spanish War, they sent a larger proportion of their men into the service than almost any other section of our country. Let us not overlook the fact that it demands courage of a high order for one to stay in a feud-infested district, conscious of being marked for slaughter, stay there month in and month out, year in and year out, not knowing at what moment he may be set by overpowering numbers, from what laurel thicket he may be shot, or at what hour of the night he may be called to his door and struck dead before his family. On the credit side of their valor, then, be it entered that few mountaineers will shrink from such ordeal when, even from no fault of their own, it is thrust upon them. The blood feud is simply a horrible survival of medievalism. It is the Highlanders' misfortune to be stranded far out of the course of civilization. He is no worse than that bygone age that he really belongs to. In some ways, he is better. He is far less cruel than his ancestors were, than our ancestors were. He does not torture with the tumbrel, the stocks, the ducking stool, the pillory, the branding irons, the ear pruners, the nostril shears, and tongue branks that were in everyday use under the old criminal code. He does not tie a woman to the cart's tail and publicly lash her bare back until it streams with blood. Nor does he hang a man for picking somebody's pocket of 12 pence and a farthing. He does not go slumming in Bedlam, paying tuppence for the sport of mocking the maniacs until they rattle their chains in rage or horror. He does not turn executions of criminals into public festivals. He never has been known to burn a condemned one at the stake. If he hangs a man, he does not first draw his entrails and burn them before his eyes, with a mob crowding about to jeer the poor devil's flinching, or to compliment him on his nerve. Yet all these pleasantries were proper and legal in Christian Britain 2 centuries ago. This isolated and belated people who still carry on the blood feud are not half so much to blame for such a savage survival as the rich, powerful, educated 20th century nation that abandons them as if they were hopelessly derelict or wrecked. It took but a few decades to civilize Scotland. How much swifter and surer and easier are our means of enlightenment today? Let us not forget that these Highlanders are blood of our blood and bone of our bone, for they are old-time Americans to a man, proud of their nationality and passionately loyal to the flag that they, more than any other of us, according to their strength, have fought and suffered for. End of section 30. Section 31 of Our Southern Highlanders by Horace Kephart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Southern Highlanders, Chapter 16, Who Are the Mountaineers? Part 1. The southern Appalachian Mountains happen to be parceled out among 8 different states, and for that reason they are seldom considered as a geographical unit. In the same way, their inhabitants are thought of as Kentucky Mountaineers or Carolina Mountaineers and so on, but not often as a body of Appalachian mountaineers, and yet these inhabitants are as distinct in ethnographic group as the mountains themselves are a geographic group. The mountaineers are homogeneous so far as speech and manners and experiences and ideals can make them. In the aggregate, they are nearly twice as numerous and cover twice as much territory as any one of the states among which they have been distributed, but in each of these states they occupy only the backyard and generally take back seats in the councils of the Commonwealth. They have been fenced off from each other by political boundaries and have no such coherence among themselves as would come from common leadership or a sense of common origin and mutual dependence. And they are a people without annals. Back of their grandfathers, they have neither screed nor hearsay. Born in the country and ain't never been out of it is all that most of them can say for themselves. Here and there one will assert, my foreparents were principally Scotch, or us Baumgartners was Dutch. But such traditions are of far back foreign origin are uncommon. Who are these Southern mountaineers? Whence came they? What is the secret of their belatedness and their isolation? Before the Civil War, they were seldom heard of in the outside world. Vaguely, it was understood that the Appalachian highlands were occupied by a peculiar people called mountain whites. This odd name was given them not to distinguish them from mountain Negroes, for there were practically no mountain Negroes, but to indicate their similarity in social condition and economic status to the poor whites of the southern lowlands. It was assumed, on no historical basis whatsoever, that the Highlanders came from the more venturesome or desperate element of the poor whites and differed from these only to the extent that environment had shaped them. Since this theory still prevails throughout the South and is accepted generally elsewhere on its face value, it deserves just enough consideration to refute it. The unfortunate class known as poor whites in the South is descended mainly from the convicts and indentured servants with which England supplied labor to the southern plantations before slavery days. The Cavaliers who founded and dominated Southern society came from the conservative, the feudal element of England. Their character and training were essentially aristocratic and military. They were not town dwellers, but masters of plantations. Their chief crop and article of export was tobacco. The culture of tobacco required an abundance of cheap and servile labor. On the plantations, there was little demand for skilled labor, small room anywhere for a middle class of manufacturers and merchants, no inducement for independent farmers who would till with their own hands. Outside of the planters and a small professional class, there was little employment offered, save what was menial and degrading. Consequently, the South was shunned from the beginning by British yeomanry and by the thrifty Teutons, such as flocked into the northern provinces. The demand for menials on the plantations was met then by importing bond servants from Great Britain. These were obtained in three ways. Number one, convicted criminals were deported to serve out their terms on the plantations. Some of these had been charged only with political offenses and had the making of good citizens, but the greater number were rogues of the shiftless and petty delinquent order, such as were too lazy to work but not desperate enough to have incurred capital sentences. 2. Boys and girls, chiefly from the slums of British seaports, were kidnapped and sold into temporary slavery on the plantations. 3. Impoverished people who wished to emigrate but could not pay for their passage voluntarily sold their services for a term of years in return for transportation. Thus, a considerable proportion of the white laborers of the South in the 17th century were criminals or ne'er-do-wells from the start. A large number of the others came from the dregs of society. As for the remainder, the companionships into which they were thrust, the brutalities to which they were subjected, their impotence before the law, the contempt in which they were held by the ruling caste, and the wretchedness of their prospect when released, were enough to undermine all but the strongest characters. Few ever succeeded in rising to respectable positions. Then came a vast social change. At a time when the laboring classes of Europe had achieved emancipation from serfdom and feudalism was overthrown, African slavery in our own Southland laid the foundation for a new feudalism. Southern society reverted to a type that the rest of the civilized world had outgrown. The effect upon white labor was deplorable. The former bond servants were now freedmen, it is true, but freedmen shorn of such opportunities as they were fitted to use. Sprung from a more or less degraded stock, still branded by caste, untrained to any career-demanding skill and intelligence, devitalized by evil habits of life, densely ignorant of the world around them, these, the naturally shiftless, were now turned out into the backwoods to shift for themselves. It was inevitable that most of them should degenerate even below the level of their former estate, for they were no longer forced into steady industry. The white freedmen generally became squatters on such land as was unfit for tobacco, cotton, and other crops profitable to slave owners. As the plantations expanded, these freedmen were pushed further and further back upon more and more sterile soil. They became pine landers, or piney woods people, sand hillers, knob people, corn crackers, or crackers, gaining a bare subsistence from corn planted and tended chiefly by the women and the children, from hogs running wild in the forest, and from desultory hunting and fishing. As a class, such whites lapsed into sloth and apathy. Even the institution of slavery they regarded with cynical tolerance, doubtless realizing that if it were not for the blacks, they would be slaves themselves. Now, these poor whites had nothing to do with settling the mountains. There was then, and still is, plenty of wild land for them in their native lowlands. They had neither the initiative nor the courage to seek a promised land far away among the unexplored and savage peaks of the western country. They were a brave enough folk in facing familiar dangers, but they had a terror of the unknown, being densely ignorant and superstitious. The mountains, to those who ever heard of them, suggested nothing but laborious climbing amid mysterious and portentous perils. The poor whites were not Highlanders by descent, nor had they a whit of the bold, self-reliant spirit of our western pioneers. They never entered Appalachia until after it had been won and settled by a far manlier race, and even then they went only in driblets. The theory that the southern mountains were peopled mainly by outcasts or refugees from old settlements in the lowlands rests on no other basis than imagination. How the mountains actually were settled is another and very different story. The first frontiersmen of the Appalachians were those Swiss and Palatine Germans who began flocking into Pennsylvania about 1682. They settled westward of the Quakers in the fertile limestone belts at the foot of the Blue Ridge and the Alleghanies. Here they formed the Quakers' buffer against the Indians, and for some time theirs were the westernmost settlements of the British subjects in America. These Germans were of Reformed or Lutheran faith. They were strongly democratic in social sense, and they detested slavery. They were model farmers, and many of them were skilled workmen at trades. Shortly after the tide of German immigration set into Pennsylvania, another and quite different class of foreigners began to arrive in this province, attracted hither by the same lodestones that drew the Germans, namely, democratic institutions and religious liberty. These newcomers were the Scotch-Irish, or the Ulstermen of Ireland. When James I in 1607 confiscated the estates of the native Irish in 6 counties of Ulster, he planted them with Scotch and English Presbyterians. These outsiders came to be known as Scotch-Irish because they were chiefly of Scotch blood and had settled in Ireland. The native Irish, to whom they were alien both by blood and by religion, detested them as usurpers and fought them many a bloody battle. In time, as their leases in Ulster began to expire, the Scotch-Irish themselves came in conflict with the Crown, by whom they were persecuted and evicted. Then the Ulstermen began immigrating in large numbers to Pennsylvania. As Feud says, in the 2 years that followed the Antrim evictions, 30,000 Protestants left Ulster for a land where there was no legal robbery and where those who sowed the seed could reap the harvest. So it was that these people became in their turn our westernmost frontiersmen, taking up land just outside the German settlements. Immediately they began to clash with the Indians, and there followed a long series of border wars waged with extreme ferocity, in which sometimes it is hard to say which side was most to blame. One thing, however, is certain. If any race was ordained to exterminate the Indians, that race was the Scotch-Irish. They were a brave but hot-headed folk, as might be expected of a people who for a century had been planted amid hostile Hibernians. Justin Winsor describes them as having all that excitable character which goes with a keen-minded adherence to original sin, total depravity, predestination, and election, and as seeing no use in an Indian but to be a target for their bullets. They were quick-witted as well as quick-tempered, rather visionary, imperious, and aggressive. Being by tradition and habit a border people, the Scotch-Irish pushed to the extreme western fringe of settlement amid the Alleghanies. They were not over-solicitous about the quality of soil. When Arthur Lee of Virginia was telling Dr. Samuel Johnson in London of a colony of Scotch who had settled upon a particularly sterile tract in western Virginia, and had expressed his wonder that they should do so, Johnson replied, "Why, sir, all barrenness is comparative. The Scotch will never know that it is barren." West of the Susquehanna, however, the land was so rocky and poor that even the Scotch shied at it. And so, when eastern Pennsylvania became crowded, the overflow of settlers passed not westward, but southwestward, along the Cumberland Valley, into western Maryland, and then into the Shenandoah, and those other long, narrow, parallel valleys of western Virginia that we noted in our first chapter. This western region still lay unoccupied and scarcely known by the Virginians themselves. Its fertile lands were discovered by Pennsylvania Dutchmen. The first house in western Virginia was erected by one of them, Hoist Height, and he established a colony of his people near the future site of Winchester. A majority of those who settled in the eastern part of the Shenandoah Valley were Pennsylvania Dutch, while the Scotch-Irish, following in their train, pushed a little to the west of them and occupied more exposed positions. There were representatives of other races along the border, English, Irish, French Huguenots, and so on, but everywhere the Scotch-Irish and the Germans predominated. And the southwestward movement, once started, never stopped. So there went on a gradual but sure progress of northern peoples across the Potomac, up the Shenandoah, across the Staunton, the Dan, the Yadkin, until the western Piedmont and foothill region of Carolina was similarly settled, chiefly by Pennsylvanians. The archivist of North Carolina, the late William L. Saunders, Secretary of State, said in one of his historical sketches that to Lancaster and York counties in Pennsylvania, North Carolina owes more of her population than to any other known part of the world. He called attention to the interesting fact that when the North Carolina boys of Scotch-Irish and Pennsylvania Dutch descent followed Lee into Pennsylvania in the Gettysburg Campaign, they were returning to the homes of their ancestors by precisely the same route that those ancestors had taken in going south. End of Section 31. Section 32 of Our Southern Highlanders by Horace Kephart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Southern Highlanders, Chapter 16, Who Are the Mountaineers? Part 2. Among those who made the long trek from Pennsylvania southward in the 18th century were Daniel Boone and the ancestors of David Crockett, Samuel Houston, John C. Calhoun, Stonewall Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln. Boone and the Lincolns, although English themselves, had been neighbors in Berks County, one of the most German parts of all eastern Pennsylvania. So the western Piedmont and the mountains were settled neither by Cavaliers nor by poor whites, but by a radically distinct and even antagonistic people who are appropriately called the Roundheads of the South. These Roundheads had little or nothing to do with slavery, detested the state church, loathed tithes, and distrusted all authority save that of conspicuous merit and natural justice. The first characteristic that these pioneers developed was an intense individualism. The strong and even violent independence that made them forsake all the comforts of civilization and prefer the wild freedom of the border, was fanned at times into turbulence and riot, but it blazed forth at a happy time for this country when our liberties were imperiled. Daniel Boone first appears in history when from his new home on the Yadkin he crossed the Blue Ridge and the Unakas into that part of western Carolina which is now eastern Tennessee. He was exploring the Watauga region as early as 1760. Both British and French Indian traders and soldiers had been in this region before him, but had left few marks of their wanderings. In 1761, a party of hunters from Pennsylvania and contiguous counties of Virginia, piloted by Boone, began to use this region as a hunting ground on account of the great abundance of game. From them, and especially from Boone, the fame of its attractions spread to the settlements on the eastern slope of the mountains, and in the winter of 1768 and 69, the first permanent occupation of eastern Tennessee was made by a few families from North Carolina. About this time there broke out in Carolina a struggle between the independent settlers of the Piedmont and the rich trading and official class of the coast. The former rose in bodies under the name of Regulators, and a battle followed in which they were defeated. To escape from the persecutions of the aristocracy, many of the Regulators and their friends crossed the Appalachian Mountains and built their cabins in the Watauga region. Here, in 1772, there was established by these rebels the first republic in America, based upon a written constitution, the first ever adopted by a community of American-born free men. Of these pioneers in the winning of the West, Theodore Roosevelt says, "As in Western Virginia the first settlers came for the most part from Pennsylvania, so, in turn, in what was then western North Carolina and is now eastern Tennessee, the first settlers came mainly from Virginia and indeed in great part from this same Pennsylvania stock." Boone first visited Kentucky on a hunting trip in 1769. 6 years later, he began to colonize it in flat defiance of the British government and in the face of a menacing proclamation from the royal governor of North Carolina. On the Kentucky River, 3 days after the Battle of Lexington, the flag of the new colony of Transylvania was run up on his fort at Boonesboro. It was not until the following August that these rebels of Kentucky heard of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and celebrated it with shrill war whoops around a bonfire in the center of their stockade. Such was the stuff of which the Appalachian frontiersmen were made. They were the first Americans to cut loose entirely from the seaboard and fall back upon their own resources. They were the first to establish governments of their own in defiance of king and aristocracy. Says John Fiske, "Jefferson is often called the father of modern American democracy, and in a certain sense the Shenandoah Valley and adjacent Appalachian regions may be called its cradle." In that rude frontier society, life assumed many new aspects. Old customs were forgotten, old distinctions abolished, social equality acquired even more importance than unchecked individualism. The notions, sometimes crude and noxious, sometimes just and wholesome, which characterized Jeffersonian democracy, flourished greatly on the frontier and have thence been propagated eastward through the older communities, affecting their legislation and their politics more or less according to frequency of contact and intercourse. Massachusetts, relatively remote and relatively ancient, has been perhaps least affected by this group of ideas, but all parts of the United States have felt its influence powerfully. This phase of democracy, which is destined to continue so long as frontier life retains any importance, can nowhere be so well studied in its beginnings as among the Presbyterian population of the Appalachian region in the 18th century. During the Revolution, the Appalachian frontier was held by a double line of the men whom we have been considering, one line east of the mountains and the other west of them. The mountain region itself remained almost uninhabited by whites because the pioneers who crossed it were seeking better hunting grounds and farmsteads than the mountains afforded. It was not until the buffalo and elk and beaver had been driven out of Tennessee and Kentucky, and those rolling savannas were being fenced and tilled, that much attention was given to the mountains proper. Then small companies of hunters and trappers from both east and west began to move into the highlands and settle there. These explorers, pushing outward from the cross-mountain trails in every direction, found many interesting things that had been overlooked in the scurry of migration westward. They discovered fair river valleys and rich coves adapted to tillage, which soon attracted settlers of a better class, and so gradually the mountain solitudes began to echo with the ring of axes and the lowing of herds. By 1830, about 1 million permanent settlers occupied the southern Appalachians. Naturally, most of them came from adjoining regions, from the foot of the Blue Ridge on one side and from the foot of the Unakas or the Cumberlands on the other, and hence they were chiefly of the same frontier stock that we have been describing. No colonies of farmers from a distance ever have been imported into the mountains, down to our own day. Deterioration of the mountain people began as soon as population began to press upon the limits of subsistence. At first, naturally, the best people among the mountaineers were attracted to the best lands, and there today, in the generous river valleys, we find a class of citizens superior to the average mountaineers that we've been considering in this book. But the number and extent of such valleys was narrowly limited. The United States topographers report that in Appalachia as a whole, the mountain slopes occupy 90% of the total area, and that 85% of the land has a steeper slope than 1 foot in 5. So as the years passed, a larger and larger proportion of the Highlanders were forced back along the creek branches and up along the steep hillsides to scrabble for a living. It will be asked, why did not these overplus do as other crowded Americans did, move west? First, because they were so immured in the mountains, so utterly cut off from communication with the outer world, that they did not know anything about the opportunities afforded new settlers in faraway lands. Moving west to them would have meant merely going a few days' wagon travel down into the lowlands of Kentucky or Tennessee, which already were thickly settled by a people of very different social class. Here, they could not hope to be anything but tenants or menials, ruled over by proprietors or bosses, and they would die rather than endure such treatment. As for the new lands of the farther west, there was scarce a peasant in Ireland or in Scandinavia but knew more about them than did the southern mountaineers. Second, because they were passionately attached to their homes and kindred, to their own old-fashioned ways. The mountaineer shrinks from lowland society as he does from the water and the climate of such regions. He is never at ease until back with his home folk, footloose and free. Third, because there was nothing in his environment to arouse ambition. The hard, hopeless life of the mountain farm, sustained only by a meager and ill-cooked diet, begat laziness and shiftless unconcern. Finally, the poverty of the hillside farmers and branchwater people was so extreme that they could not gather funds to emigrate with. There were no industries to which a man might turn and earn ready money, no markets in which he could sell a surplus from the farm. So, while the transmontane settlers grew rapidly in wealth and culture, their kinsfolk back in the mountains either stood still or retrograded, and the contrast was due not merely so much to any difference of capacity as to a law of nature that dooms an isolated and impoverished people to deterioration. Beyond this, it is not to be overlooked that the mountains were cursed with a considerable incubus of naturally weak or depraved characters, not lowland poor whites, but a miscellaneous flotsam from all quarters which, after more or less circling around and around, was drawn into the stagnant eddy of highland society as derelicts drift into the Sargasso Sea. In the train of western immigration there were some feeble souls who never got across the mountains. These have been described tersely as the men who lost heart on account of a broken axle. The anemic element thus introduced is less noticeable in Kentucky than in Virginia and the states farther south, for the reason, no doubt, that it took at least 2 axles to reach Kentucky, but it exists in all parts of Appalachia. Moreover, the vast roughs of the mountain region offered harborage for outlaws, desperadoes of the border, and here many of them settled and propagated their kind. In the backwoods, one cannot choose his neighbors. All are on equal footing, hence the contagion of crime and shiftlessness spreads to decent families and tends to undermine them. We can understand, then, how it happened in many cases that Highland families founded by well-informed and thrifty pioneers deteriorated into illiterate and idle triflers all run down at heels. Lincoln's family is an apt illustration. His grandfather sold his Virginia farms for $17,000 and bought large tracts of land in Kentucky. But Abraham Lincoln's father set up housekeeping in a shed, later built a log hut of one room without doors or windows, although he was a carpenter by trade, and then moved to another cabin a little better. Tired of it, moved over into Indiana and made his family spend the winter in a half-faced camp where they were saved from freezing by keeping up a great log fire in front of a lean-to through days and nights when the temperature was far below zero. The Lincolns were not mountaineers, but they were of the same stock and were subjected to much the same vicissitudes. So the Southern Highlanders languished in isolation, sunk in a Rip Van Winkle sleep until aroused by the thunder crash of the Civil War. Let John Fox tell the extraordinary result of that awakening. The American mountaineer was discovered, I say, at the beginning of the war when the Confederate leaders were counting on the presumption that Mason and Dixon's line was the dividing line between the North and the South, and formed, therefore, the plan of marching an army from Wheeling in West Virginia to some point on the lakes, and thus disserving the North at one blow. The plan seems so feasible that it is said to have materially aided the sale of Confederate bonds in England, but when Captain Garnett, a West Point graduate, started to carry it out, he got no further than Harper's Ferry. And when he struck the mountains, he struck enemies who shot at his men from ambush, cut down bridges before him, carried the news of his march to the Federals, and Garnett himself fell with a bullet from a mountaineer's squirrel rifle at Harper's Ferry. And then the South began to realize what a long, lean, powerful arm of the Union it was that the Southern mountaineers stretched through its very vitals, for that arm helped hold Kentucky in the Union by giving preponderance to the Union sympathizers in the bluegrass. It kept the East Tennesseans loyal to the man. It made West Virginia, as the phrase goes, secede from secession. It drew out a horde of 100,000 volunteers when Lincoln called for troops, depleting Jackson County, Kentucky, for instance, of every male under 60 years of age and over 15, and it raised a hostile barrier between the armies of the coast and the armies of the Mississippi. The North has never realized, perhaps, what it owes for its victory to this non-slaveholding Southern mountaineer. President Frost of Berea College says, "The loyalty of this region in the Civil War was a surprise to both Northern and to Southern statesmen. The mountain people owned land but did not own slaves, and the national feeling of the Revolutionary period had not spent its force among them. Their services in West Virginia and East Tennessee are perhaps generally known, but the very few know or remember that the whole mountain region was loyal except where conscripted. General Carl Schurz had soldiers enlisted in the mountains of Alabama, and the writer has recently seen a letter written by the Confederate governor of South Carolina in which he relates to General Hardee the troubles caused by Union sentiment in the mountain counties. It is pathetic to know how these mountain regiments disbanded with no poet or historian or monument to perpetuate the memory of their valor. The very flag that was first on Lookout Mountain and waved above the clouds was lost to fame in an obscure mountain home until Berea discovered and rescued it from oblivion and destruction." It may be added that no other part of our country suffered longer or more severely from the aftermath of the war. Throughout that struggle, the mountain region was a nest for bushwhackers and bandits that preyed upon the aged and the defenseless who were left at home, and thus there was left an evil legacy of neighborhood wrongs and private grudges. Most of the mountain counties had incurred the bitter hostility of their own states by standing loyal to the Union. After Appomattox, they were cast back into a worse isolation than they had ever known. Most unfortunately, too, the federal government at this juncture, instead of interposing to restore law and order in the highlands, turned the loyalty of the mountaineers into outlawry, as in 1794, by imposing a prohibitive excise tax upon their chief merchantable commodity. Left then to their own devices, unchecked by any stronger arm, unflamed by a multitude of personal wrongs, habituated to the shedding of human blood, contemptuous of state laws that did not reach them, enraged by federal acts that impugned, as they thought, an inalienable right of man, it was inevitable that this fiery and vindictive race should fall speedily into warring among themselves. Old scores were now to be wiped out in a reign of terror. The open combat of bannered war was turned into the secret ferocity of family feuds. But the mountaineers of today are face to face with a mighty change. The feud epoch has ceased throughout the greater part of Appalachia. A new era dawns. Everywhere the highways of civilization are pushing into remote mountain fastnesses. Vast enterprises are being installed. The timber and the minerals are being garnered. The mighty water power that has been running to waste since these mountains rose from the primal sea is now about to be harnessed in the service of man. Along with this economic revolution will come inevitably good schools, newspapers, a finer and more liberal social life. The Highlander at last is to be caught up in the current of human progress. End of section 32. Section 33 of Our Southern Highlanders by Horace Kephart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Southern Highlanders, Chapter 17, When the Sleeper Wakes, Part 1. The Southern Mountaineers are preeminently a rural folk. When the 20th century opened, only 4% of them dwelt in cities of 8,000 inhabitants and upwards. There were but 7 such cities in all Appalachia, a region larger than England and Scotland combined, and these owed their development to outside influences. Only 77 out of 186 mountain counties had towns of 1,000 and upwards. Our Highlanders are the most homogeneous people in the United States. In 1900, out of a total population of 3,039,835, there were only 18,617 of foreign birth. This includes the cities and the industrial camps. Back in the mountains, a man using any other tongue than English or speaking broken English was regarded as a freak. 9 mountain counties of Virginia, 4 of West Virginia, 15 of Kentucky, 10 of Tennessee, 9 of North Carolina, 8 of Georgia, 2 of Alabama, and 1 of South Carolina had less than 10 foreign-born residents each. 3 of them had none at all. Compare the North Atlantic states. In this same census year, 57% of the people lived in the cities of 8,000 and upwards. As for foreigners, the one city of Fall River, Massachusetts, with 104,863 inhabitants, had 50,042 of foreign birth. The mountains proper are free not only from foreigners but from Negroes as well. There are many blacks in the larger valleys and towns, but throughout most of Appalachia the population is almost exclusively white. In 1900, Jackson County, Kentucky, the same that sent every one of its sons into the Union Army who could bear arms, had only 19 Negroes living among 10,542 whites. Johnson County, Kentucky, only 1 black resident among 13,729 whites. Dickinson County, Virginia, not a single Negro within its borders. In many mountain settlements, Negroes are not allowed to tarry. It has been assumed that this prejudice against colored folk had its origin far back in the time when poor whites found themselves thrust aside by competition with slave labor. This is an error. Our mountaineers never had to compete with slavery. Few of them knew anything about it except from hearsay. Their dislike of Negroes is simply an instinctive racial antipathy plus a contempt for anyone who submits to servile conditions. A neighbor in the Smokies said to me, "I believe in treating niggers square. The Bible says they're human, leastways some says it does, and so there ought to be a place for them, but it's someplace else, not around me." That is the whole thing in a nutshell. Here, then, is Appalachia, one of the great landlocked areas of the globe, more English in speech than Britain itself, more American by blood than any other part of America, encompassed by a high-tensioned civilization, yet less affected today by modern ideas, less cognizant of modern progress than any other part of the English-speaking world. Of course, such an anomaly cannot continue. Commercialism has discovered the mountains at last, and no sentiment, however honest, however hallowed, can keep it out. The transformation is swift. Suddenly, the mountaineer is awakened from his 18th century bed by the blare of steam whistles and the boom of dynamite. He sees his forests leveled and whisked away, his rivers dammed by concrete walls and shot into turbines that outpower all the horses in Appalachia. He is dazed by electric lights, nonplussed by speaking wires, awed by vast transfers of property, incensed by rude demands. Aroused now and wide-eyed, he realizes with sinking heart that here is a sudden end of that old dispensation under which he and his ancestors were born, the beginning of a new order that heeds him and his neighbors not a whit. All this insults his conservatism. The old way was the established order of the universe. To change it is fairly impious. What is the good of all this fuss and fury? That 50-story building they tell about in their big city, what is it but another Tower of Babel? And these silly, stuck-up strangers who brag and brag about modern improvement, what are they under their fine manners and fine clothes? Hirelings, all. Shrewdly he observes them in their relations to each other. Each man is some man's servant, every soul is by some other's presence quite discrowned. Proudly he contrasts his ragged self. He who never has acknowledged a superior, never has taken an order from living man save as a patriot in time of war, and he turns upon his heel. Yet, before he can fairly credit it as a reality, the lands around his home are bought up by corporations. All about him, slash, crash go the devastating forces. His old neighbors vanish. New and unwelcome ones swarm in. He is crowded, but ignored. His hard-earned patrimony is robbed of all that made it precious, its home-like seclusion, independence, dignity. He sells out and moves away to some uninvaded place where he will not be bothered. "I don't like these improvements," said an old mountaineer to me. "Some calls them progress and says they put money into circulation, so they do, but who gets it?" There is a class of Highlanders more sanguine, more adaptable, that welcomes all outsiders who come with skill and capital to develop their country. Many of these are shrewd traders in merchandise or in real estate, or they are capable foremen who can handle native labor much better than any strangers could. Such men naturally profit by the change. Others, deluded by what seems easy money, sell their little homesteads for just enough cash to set them up as laborers in town or camp. Being untrained to any trade, they can get only the lowest wages, which are quickly dissipated in rent and in foods that formerly they raised for themselves. Unused to continuous labor, they irk under its discipline, drop out, and fall into desultory habits. Meantime, false ambitions arise, especially among the women folk. Store credit soon runs such a family into debt. "When I was a young man," said one of my neighbors, "the traders never thought of bringing meal in here. If a man run out of meal, why, he was just out, and he had to live on taters or something else. Nowadays, we dress better and live better, but some other feller always has his hands in our pockets." Then it is goodbye to the old independence that made such characters manly. Enmeshed in obligations that they cannot meet, they struggle vainly, brood hopelessly, and lose that dearest of all possessions, their self-respect. Servility is literal hell to a mountaineer, and when it is forced upon him, he turns into a mean, underhanded, slinking fellow, easily tempted into crime. The curse of our invading civilization is that its vanguard is composed of men who care nothing for the welfare of the people they dispossess. A northern lumberman admitted to me, with frankness unusual in his class, that all we want here is to get the most we can out of this country as quick as we can and then get out. This is all that we can expect of those who exploit raw materials or of manufacturers that employ only cheap labor. Until we have industries that demand skilled workmen and until manual training schools are established in the mountains, we may look for deterioration rather than betterment of those Highlanders who leave their farms. All who know the mountaineers intimately have observed that the sudden inroad of commercialism has a bad effect upon them. As President Frost says, "Ruthless change is knocking at the door of every mountain cabin. The jackals of civilization have already abused the confidence of many a highland home. The lumber, the coal, and mineral wealth of the mountains is to be possessed, and the unprincipled vanguard of commercialism can easily debauch a simple people. The question is whether the mountain people can be enlightened and guided so that they can have a part in the development of their own country, or whether they must give place to foreigners and melt away like so many Indians. It is easy to say that the fittest will survive, but the fittest for what?" Miss Miles answers, "I have heard it said that civilization, when it touches the people of the backwoods, acts as a useful precipitant in thus sending the dregs to the bottom. As a matter of fact, it is only the shrewder and more determined, not the truly fit, that survive the struggle. Among these very submerged ones, reduced to dependence on an alien people, there are thousands who inherit the skill of their forefathers who fashioned their own locks, musical instruments, and guns. And these very women who are breaking their health and spirit over a thankless tub of suds ought surely to turn their talents to better account, ought to be designing and weaving coverlets and Roman striped rugs, or piecing the quilt patterns now so popular. Need these razors be used to cut grindstones? Must these free folk, who are in many ways the truest Americans of America, be brought under the yoke of caste division, to the degradation of all their finer qualities merely for the lack of the right work to do? There are some who would have it so, who would calmly write for these our own kindred as for the Indians fuerent their day is past. In a history of Southern literature written not long ago by a professor in the University of Virginia, a sketch of Miss Murphy's work closes with these words. There, at Beersheba Springs, Tennessee, it was that she first studied the curious type of humanity, the Tennessee mountaineer, a people so ignorant, so superstitious, so far behind the world of today as to excite wonder and even pity in all who see them. She is telling the story of a people who, in these opening years of the 20th century, wander on through their limited range of life, much as their ancestors for generations have wandered. They, too, will sometime vanish. The sooner, the better. End of section 33. Section 34 of Our Southern Highlanders by Horace Kephart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Our Southern Highlanders, Chapter 17, When the Sleeper Wakes, Part 2. One cannot read such a sentiment without wonder and even pity for the ignorance of history and of human nature that it discloses. Is the case of our mountaineers so much worse than that of the Scottish Highlanders of 2 centuries ago? We know that those Scotchmen did not vanish, the quicker the better. What were they before civilization reached them? Let us open the ready pages of Macaulay. It is not easy for a modern Englishman to believe that in the time of his great-grandfathers, St. James's Street had as little connection with the Grampians as with the Andes, yet so it was. In the south of our island, scarcely anything was known about the Celtic part of Scotland, and what was known excited no feeling but contempt and loathing. It is not strange that the wild Scotch, as they were sometimes called, should, in the 17th century, have been considered by the Saxons as mere savages. But it is surely strange that, considered as savages, they should not have been objects of interest and curiosity. The English were then abundantly inquisitive about the manners of rude nations separated from our island by great continents and oceans. Numerous books were printed describing the laws, the superstitions, the cabins, the repasts, the dresses, the marriages, the funerals of Laplanders and Hottentots, Mohawks, and Malays. The plays and poems of that age are full of allusions to the usages of black men of Africa and the red men of America. The only barbarian about whom there was no wish to have any information was the Highlander. While the old Gaelic institutions were in full vigor, no account of them was given by any observer qualified to judge of them fairly. Had such an observer studied the character of the Highlanders, he would doubtless have found it in closely intermingled, the good and the bad qualities of an uncivilized nation. He would have found that the people had no love for their country or for their king, that they had no attachment to any commonwealth larger than the clan, or to any magistrate superior to the chief. He would have found that life was governed by a code of morality and honor widely different from that which is established in peaceful and prosperous societies. He would have learned that a stab in the back or a shot from behind a fragment of rock were approved modes of taking satisfaction for insults. He would have heard men relate boastfully how they or their fathers had racked on hereditary enemies in a neighboring valley such vengeance as would have made old soldiers of the 30 Years' War shudder. He would have found that robbery was held to be a calling not merely innocent but honorable. He would have seen wherever he turned that dislike of steady industry and that disposition to throw on the weaker sex the heaviest part of manual labor, which are characteristic of savages. He would have been struck by the spectacle of athletic men basking in the sun, angling for salmon or taking aim at grouse, while their aged mothers, their pregnant wives, their tender daughters were reaping the scanty harvest of oats. Nor did the women repine at their hard lot. In their view, it was quite fit that a man, especially if he assumed the aristocratic title of Dooney Wassel and adorned his bonnet with the eagle's feather, should take his ease, except when he was fighting, hunting, or marauding. To mention the name of such a man in connection with commerce or with any mechanical art was an insult. Agriculture was indeed less despised, yet the high-born warrior was much more becomingly employed in plundering the land of others than in tilling his own. The religion of the greater part of the Highlands was a rude mixture of popery and paganism. The symbol of redemption was associated with heathen sacrifices and incantations. Baptized men poured libations of ale on one demon and set out drinks offering of milk for another. Seers wrapped themselves up in bulls' hides and awaited in that vesture the inspiration which was to reveal the future. Even among those minstrels and genealogists whose hereditary vocation was to preserve the memory of past events, an inquirer would have found very few who could read. In truth, he might easily have journeyed from sea to sea without discovering a page of Gaelic printed or written. The price which he would have had to pay for his knowledge of the country would have been heavy. He would have had to endure hardships as great as if he had sojourned among the Eskimo or the Samoyeds, here and there, indeed, at the castle of some great lord who had a seat in the Parliament and Privy Council, and who was accustomed to pass a large part of his life in the cities of the South, might have been found wigs and embroidered coats, plate and fine linen, lace and jewels, French dishes and French wines. But in general, the traveler would have been forced to content himself with very different quarters. In many dwellings the furniture, the food, the clothing, nay, the very hair and skin of his hosts would have put his philosophy to the proof. His lodging would sometimes have been in a hut of which every nook would have swarmed with vermin. He would have inhaled an atmosphere thick with peat smoke and foul with 100 exhalations. At supper, grain fit only for horses would have been set before him, accompanied with a cake of blood drawn from a living cow. Some of the company with whom he would have feasted would have been covered with cutaneous eruptions, and others would have been smeared with tar like sheep. His couch would have been the bare earth, dry or wet as the weather might be, and from that couch he would have risen half poisoned with stench, half blind with the reek of turf, and half mad with the itch. This is not an attractive picture, and yet an enlightened and dispassionate observer would have found in the character and manners of this rude people something which might well excite admiration and a good hope. Their courage was what great exploits achieved in all the 4 quarters of the globe have since proved it to be. Their intense attachment to their own tribe and to their own patriarch, though politically a great evil, partook of the nature of virtue. The sentiment was misdirected and ill-regulated, but still it was heroic. There must be some elevation of soul in a man who loves the society of which he is a member and the leader whom he follows with a love stronger than the love of life. It was true that the Highlander had few scruples about shedding the blood of an enemy, but it was not less true that he had high notions of the duty of observing faith to allies and hospitality to guests. It was true that the Highlander had few scruples about shedding the blood of an enemy, but it was not less true that he had high notions of the duty of observing faith to allies and hospitality to guests. It was true that his predatory habits were most pernicious to the Commonwealth, yet those erred greatly who imagined that he bore any resemblance to villains who in rich and well-governed communities live by stealing. When he drove before him the herds of lowland farmers up the pass which led to his native glen, he no more considered himself a thief than the Raleighs and the Drakes considered themselves as thieves when they divided the cargoes of Spanish galleons. He was a warrior, seizing lawful prize of war never once intermitted during the 35 generations which had passed away since the Teutonic invaders had driven the children of the soil to the mountains. His inordinate pride of birth and his contempt for labor and trade were indeed great weaknesses and had done far more than the inclemency of the air and the sterility of the soil to keep his country poor and rude. Yet even here there was some compensation. It must in fairness be acknowledged that the patrician virtues were not less widely diffused among the population of the highlands than the patrician vices, as there was no other part of the island where men, sordidly clothed, lodged, and fed, indulged themselves to such a degree in the idle, sauntering habits of an aristocracy, so there was no other part of the island where such men had in such a degree the better qualities of an aristocracy, grace and dignity of manner, self-respect, and that noble sensibility which makes dishonor more terrible than death. A gentleman of Skye or Lochaber, whose clothes were begrimed with the accumulated filth of years, and whose hovel smelt worse than an English hog-sty, would often do the honors of that hovel with a lofty courtesy worthy of the splendid circles of Versailles. Though he had as little book-learning as the most stupid ploughboys of England, it would have been a great error to put him in the same intellectual rank with such ploughboys. It is indeed only by reading that men can become profoundly acquainted with any science, but the arts of poetry and rhetoric may be carried near to absolute perfection and may exercise a mighty influence on the public mind in an age in which books are wholly or almost wholly unknown. So, too, in the rudest communities of Appalachia, among the most trifling and unmoral natives of this region, among the illiterate and the hidebound, there still is much to excite admiration and good hope. I have not shrunk from telling the truth about these people, even when it was far from pleasant, but I would have preserved strict silence had I not seen, in the most backward of them, certain sterling qualities of manliness that our nation can ill afford to waste. It is a truth as old as the human race that savageries may coexist with admirable qualities of head and heart. The only people who can consistently despair of the future for even the lowest of our mountaineers are those who deny evolution and who believe, with Archbishop Usher, that man was created perfect at 9 a.m. on the 21st of October in the year B.C. 4004. Let us remember, sir and madam, that we ourselves are descended from white barbarians, from William the Conqueror. You? Very well. How many other ancestors of yours were walking about England and elsewhere at the time of William? Untold thousands of them were just such people as you can find today brawling in some mountain stillhouse, unless there's been a deal of incest somewhere along your line, and you have infinitely more of their blood in your veins than you have of the conquerors, who, by the way, could he be reincarnated, would not be tolerated in your drawing rooms for half an hour. I may have made the point too brutally plain, but if it sinks through the smug self-complacency of those who do not belong to the masses, who act as though civilization and morals and good manners were entailed to them through a mere dozen or so of selected ancestors, I remain unrepentant and unashamed. Let us thank whatever gods there be that it is not merely thou and I, our few friends and next of kin, but all humanity that scientific faith embraces and will sustain. People who have been among the Southern Mountaineers testify, says Mr. Fox, that as a race they are proud, sensitive, hospitable, kindly, obliging in an unreckoning way that is almost pathetic, honest, loyal. In spite of their common ignorance, poverty, and isolation, they are naturally capable, eager to learn, easy to uplift. Americans to the core, they make the Southern Mountains a storehouse of patriotism. In themselves, they are an important offset to the old world outcasts whom we have welcomed to our shores, and they surely deserve as much consideration from the nations as the Negroes or as the heathen to whom we give millions. President Frost of Berea College, who has worked among these people for nearly a lifetime and has helped to educate their young folks by the thousands, says, "It does one's heart good to help a young Lincoln who comes walking in perhaps a 3 days' journey on foot with a few hard-earned dollars in his pocket and a great eagerness for the education he can so faintly comprehend. Scores of our young people see their first railroad train at Berea. And it is a joy to welcome the mountain girl who comes back after having taught her first school, bringing the money to pay her debts and buy her first comfortable outfit, including rubbers and suitable underclothing, and perhaps bringing with her a younger sister. Such a girl exerts a great influence in her school and mountain home. An enthusiastic mountaineer described an example in this wise: "I tell you, it takes a mighty resolute gal to do what that there gal has done. She got, I reckon, about the toughest district in the county, which is saying a good deal. And then for boarding place, well, there weren't much choice. There was one house with one room. But she kept right on, and you would have thought she was having the finest kind of time to look at her. And then the last day, when they was saying their pieces and such, some sorry fellers come in there full of moonshine and shot their revolvers. I'm a-telling you, it takes a mighty resolute gal." The great need of our mountaineers today is trained leaders of their own. The future of Appalachia lies mostly in the hands of those resolute native boys and girls who win the education fitting them for such leadership. Here is where the nation at large is summoned by a solemn duty, and it should act quickly, because commercialism exploits and debauches quickly. But the schools needed here are not ordinary graded schools. They should be vocational schools that will turn out good farmers, good mechanics, good housewives. Meantime, let a model farm be established in every mountain county, showing how to get the most out of mountain land. Such object lessons would speedily work an economic revolution. It is an economic problem, fundamentally, that the mountaineer has to face. End of Our Southern Highlanders by Horace Kephart.